Welcome to our next Bible study, looking at chapter 30 in the book of Job. From a spiritual perspective, this chapter seems to have many dynamics going on. We're going to focus in on one perspective in particular. But let me just say that this passage, Job is really contrasting the previous chapter, which is about the great things, the righteous things in his life. And we looked at was a prophecy about Jesus Christ as well, and his deeds, the deeds of the righteous, restoring people into divine connection with God. And now we have this, chapter 30, which is suddenly people turning against him, people turning against the righteous, and really mocking the righteous because things have suddenly gone wrong for them. Casting them down and considering them worthless, treating the righteous with disdain because their life suddenly took a turn. Something went wrong and they're now in a very desperate position. They're actually in the position of those needy and needing that restoration that we saw in chapter 29. So the righteous person has found themselves in the situation of those that they were previously ministering to restore into divine connection. And the rest of the world now, this passage reveals that their heart is to turn against them and say, you're out, you're outcast, we don't want anything to do with you, and treat them with disdain. But I want to take a deeper look at this passage, another level down, which is a spiritual context, to talk about actually the fate of demons in this age and how they treated Jesus when he was going to the cross. So I want to take a look at this through the lens of the crucifixion of Christ and what was happening on a spiritual level. So let's begin in verse 1. But now they mock me, men younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to put with my sheepdogs. You know the picture of sheepdogs, the picture of shepherding. It's a picture of God's people underneath the discipleship and pastoral care of God. And so when Jesus talks about these people he would disdain to put with his sheepdogs, he's talking about not including these beings in with those who look after the community of God. So what does this mean? Well, it means there are this class of spiritual beings or beings that God does not want tending his flock, his sheep. Now we know that he makes angels, his servants, flames of fire to minister to us. Well, there are those that he doesn't want ministering to us because they're not going to do us any good. So let's have a look. That's how this kind of is set right at the beginning. Of what use was the strength of their hands to me, since their vigor had gone from them? So these beings, whatever light they had, whatever strength they had, it's disappeared from them, it's dissipated, it's left them, it abandoned them. And we know that the Bible portrays this image of these angelic hosts who were in the glory of God, in the light of God, rebelled. Their place in heaven was lost. The light abandoned them because they chose to reject God in the first place. So they rejected the light, so the light could not dwell with them. And we saw in a couple of chapters earlier that there is a clear line between light and darkness cannot cross that boundary line. So these beings chose to place themselves into the darkness. Light, they no longer dwelled in the light. They could no longer minister the light to people. And so God doesn't want these spiritual beings tending to people. They have no strength to minister the righteousness of the kingdom of God. They are haggard from want and hunger. They are parched spiritual beings. They're so hungry for what they used to know, that dwelling always in God's presence, drinking always of his Spirit, being found in the place of life, They're now in darkness. They are thirsty. They are hungry. They are parched. Spirits of desolation. They roam the parched land in desolate wastelands at night. In the brush, they gathered salt herbs, and their food was the root of the broom bush. So hard to pronounce that. So these beings, they've lost everything. They're in the wilderness. They're in the wastelands. And Jesus says, when an unclean spirit comes out, it roams the desolate places and cannot find anywhere to rest. And this is what it's kind of contrasting with here. It's those evil spirits, those wicked spirits, they have no place of rest. They're in desolate wastelands. They're in the darkness. They're at night. They're hungry. They're parched. They have no light of God in them. They were banished from human society, shouted at as if they were thieves. And you know, Jesus says that the devil is a thief, a liar, a murderer. So these beings, they're kind of classed in this, and they're banished from human society. They're not allowed to minister to humans anymore. They cannot bring the light of God to us. They were forced to live in the dry stream beds, among the rocks and holes in the ground. This talks about the absence of the water of life. They're banished from accessing the river of life that we see in the book of Revelation and also in the book of Ezekiel. This flowing of the life of God to reach all of the beings in his kingdom, whether they are angelic beings or human beings. Spiritual beings drink of the presence of God and stay in his light. Access to the river of life, the thing that nourishes and gives life. These other beings, they're not allowed access to that. They chose to rebel and reject it. A base and nameless brood, they were driven out of the land. And you know, angels have names. And the devil had a name before he rebelled and had no more place in heaven. And the devil, or Satan, is now a title. He has no name. And so it's a similar fate for all those demons underneath him. They have no name. They're a nameless brood. They were driven out of the land. They have no place of rest, no place of residence. But you know, in verse 9 it says, and now those young men mock me in song. I have become a byword among them. Yes, it's talking about the physical reality of what happens to people when things go wrong for them, and the wicked, they sing song, they mock them. But the deeper level here is that those evil spirits, they mock Jesus. They detest him and keep their distance. They do not hesitate to spit in his face. They would have stirred up the Roman soldiers to treat Jesus the way he did, stirred up the crowd to treat Jesus the way he did. And we know that just before Jesus was betrayed, he spoke and said to Judas, what you have to do it quickly. And then we're told Satan entered Jesus. So this whole betrayal of Jesus, God permitted it, and God allowed it at a certain time in a certain way, according to prophecy. And Satan became his instrument to stir the people up, to rile against Jesus. And some of them spat in his face. They threw off restraint in his presence. You know, when angelic beings and spiritual beings and demons are actually presented with God in his glory, there's a trembling before him because he's magnificent and glorious. But here on the cross, in the supposed moment of weakness, these evil spirits threw off restraint in the presence of Jesus, which is something which is unusual, because if they saw him in his glory, they wouldn't do that. They'd run. On my right, the tribe attacks. They lay snares at my feet. They build their siege ramps against me. And this is echoed elsewhere when it prophesies about Jesus on the cross in his crucifixion. Similar kinds of words. They break up my road. They succeed in destroying me. And we know this is what happened with Jesus' physical body. That his body was destroyed beyond recognition, disfigured. It wasn't a pretty sight. No one can help him, they say. And you know, they derided him on the cross. People jeered at Jesus. He said he's a healer. Let him heal himself. You're the Son of God. Bring yourself down from that cross, is what they said. They taunted him. And it says they advance us through a gaping breach. Amid the ruins, they come rolling in. And this speaks about the protective walls, the spiritual walls, those boundaries that keep safe the community of God. Suddenly, surrounding Jesus in the moment of the cross were his enemies, those who made him their enemy. His dignity was driven away by the wind, safety vanished like a cloud, and terrors overwhelmed me. Verse 15. And this talks about what happened in that situation. Through the whole ordeal, safety was gone, dignity vanished. They stripped him, beat him, and mocked him by placing a purple robe upon him and a crown of thorns. He had no safety. Those thorns pierced his skin. This is horrific. But he did it in sacrificial love. And then verse 16, it talks about the final moments. And now my life ebbs away. Days of suffering grip me. Night pierces my bones. My gnawing pains never rest. Yes, of course, this is about Job and his current situation, but God often speaks through these prophets of the Old Testament to prophesy about Jesus Christ. In his great power, God becomes like clothing to me. So even though Jesus, seemingly alone on the cross, surrounded by enemies, with his bones pierced, and you know they would have been disjointed, pierced by the nails on the cross. Shooting pain would have gone through his body as those nails would have hit his nerves, and really thick nerves. Yet God became a clothing to him. It says in verse 19, he throws me into the mud and I am reduced to dust and ashes. This is a poetic prose speaking of what's going to become of him, that from dust and mud humanity came and Jesus took on a human form, and to that he will return. This is talking about what's about to happen. And then verse 20, you know, on the cross, Jesus cried, I might have the pronunciation wrong. He cried, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. It's a different language. But basically, my God, why have you forsaken me? It doesn't mean that God has forsaken him. He's actually doing a recital of a psalm, the first and the last lines, because later he says the final words of that psalm, which is, it is finished, it is done. He's opening with the words of a psalm. And it says in verse 20, I cry out to you, God, but you do not answer. I stand up, but you merely look at me. It's talking about this situation that he's crying out, but he's not saved from this predicament. He's still hanging on the cross until the last moments where he breathes his last and gives his spirit to his Father in heaven. And it says, you snatch me up and drive me before the wind. You toss me about in the storm. I know you will bring me down to death, to the place appointed for all the living. And this is what happened. Jesus went down into death. But it was for a purpose, that he might also come out resurrected, triumphant over death, so that whoever believes in him will also be triumphant over death. It no longer has a hold on anyone who is in Jesus Christ. So that kind of rounds up, really, a summary, prophecy about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and the spiritual surroundings that the demons and all the enemies, the spiritual beings who are enemies of God, enemies of his people, surrounding him, stirring the people to deride him, torment him, break him. And it ends up with him going down into death. But the story didn't end there. We know he rose again from the dead. And this is the glory of Jesus Christ. And there's more verses in this passage, but it kind of goes back into Job reflecting. And I just really want to stay focused on Jesus, because he went through such a great suffering to bring about the ultimate restoration and justice of God, restoring divine connection to us. Through the crucifixion, all the power of death, the demons and the devil, they thought they had triumphed, forcing Jesus down to the grave, ending this parade of the power of God among us, restoring divine connection. They thought they'd put an end to it. But on the third day, Jesus rose again, bringing the ultimate power of God, life over death, stealing the power of death away from the devil, taking the keys of death and Hades, unlocking them so that whoever dies may live in Jesus Christ by the power of his name, because of this crucifixion. So you know the ultimate message here is love and life. That Jesus chose to go through death for us, that we might have his life. It's a divine exchange, divine connection back to God, divine exchange. Life and death exchanged. His life, that we might not need to die and stay dead, but die and enter into beautiful everlasting life. This is the power and restoration of God, restoring us back into his ultimate design for us, to live forever as eternal beings. If you like this video and would like more mentoring or teaching materials on the biblical perspective of these spiritual gifts, why don't you join me on my Patreon? It's www.patreon.com/ChristianSeer. If you like this video, please give me a like below, subscribe and follow, and leave a comment below. Let me know if you have any questions, any thoughts. I love to hear from you, and I look forward to you joining me for the next video, which will be coming soon.